right, y'all. Welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and the brand new Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. And I've recorded more than 5,500 interviews since 2003, almost all on foreign policy, and all available for you at scotthorton.org. You can sign up for the podcast feed there, and the full interview archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. You guys on the line, I've got Ted Snider. He's our foreign policy fellow at the Institute. That's libertarianinstitute.org. And, of course, antiwar.com, and he writes at the American Conservative and Responsible Statecraft and all kinds of things. Welcome back to the show, Ted. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on the show again, Scott.
Very happy to have you here. We got a bunch of different things that you've been writing recently about the Russia-Ukraine war. Buried stories, the firing of the general in charge, multiple leaks from all different directions about special operations forces in the country, even though we've already known that, and big tough talk from the extremely effeminate president of France that he's going to make this war much worse. Just tell me, what the hell is going on, man?
Yeah, well, you just did a lot. There's a lot, and I think the last thing you touched on is a really intriguing one, in that it's been this sort of this claim, like the states. Biden's been claiming for a long time that there will not be American troops engaged in the conflict. So, Scott, I mean, it's been a totally open secret that there's some people there, and it's been a totally open secret that the West is providing everything but the bodies, right? They're giving the funding, the weapons, the training, the intelligence. They're giving everything but the bodies. And Biden's insisted that there won't be bodies because he didn't want to risk a war with Russia. And then all of a sudden, in like a 2-week period, Scott, there's like 5 high-level leaks revealing that there are, in fact, troops in Ukraine. And to me, the stunning thing was this, not just the pattern of leaks, but the question of why. Why in just 2 weeks would there be this incredible series of leaks that there's all these Western bodies in Ukraine? And it seems to me that we've reached, I say at the beginning of one of my articles, we've reached this sort of what I call this long feared fork in the road, that, the West has to accept that Ukraine's losing the war, and they really have a choice now. They either have to push Ukraine to the negotiating table, or they got to do more than send arms and aid, because arms and aid isn't going to send Ukraine. And that means they'd have to escalate by sending troops. And that means risking exactly what Biden says they've been trying to avoid all along, which is, war in Ukraine. And yet in this short period, you get this series of interviews and leaks and direct confirmations by governments that there's bodies in Ukraine, troops in Ukraine. So where do you want to start? Do you want to start with what some of the leaks are, that there's actually people already there?
Sure. Or? And actually, let's start with, what exactly are the implications? What's the difference between having clandestine deniable forces or semi-deniable forces embedded there versus dropping the 82nd Airborne in terms of, if one of them gets blown up?
Yeah, so I think it depends. I think Putin's been remarkably calm about all of this, and he's sort of said, "Who cares? We've known this all along." And just like you're sending weapons isn't going to make a difference, you're sending troops isn't going to make a difference. But the difference is if you undeniably have troops that are not just targeting intelligence but firing the long range missiles. If you've actually got troops in there doing the demining and doing the fighting, then you've got NATO in Ukraine, and Putin's made it pretty clear that NATO fighting in Ukraine is tantamount to him of NATO fighting Russian territory. And then you've got Russia, the need to defend its survival, and then you get all kinds of scary escalatory scenarios about what happens if Russia has to defend its territory. So what you get here is you get this, I don't know what's going to happen, but you get this really dangerous possibility that people have been afraid of for so long, that this war in Ukraine that has no real security interest to the West risks escalating into a possible, world war between nuclear powers. And, Putin reminded the world that that there is only one reason why countries have nuclear weapons. He says, we're not going to do it. We don't think you need to do it. We don't think it's going to be a nuclear war. But he says, remember, nuclear weapons are there so that if the sovereignty, integrity, and existence of your country is a threat, you have nuclear weapons. And then you get Macron responding that Putin shouldn't say that because we're a nuclear power and we're ready. And so all of a sudden you've got the president of Russia and the president of France engaging in this conversation about the potential of nuclear war, and who wanted to be there, over this, this fight in Ukraine. So you get this really sort of scary situation. And you've got Europe fighting each other. You've got Germany mad at France for saying it, and France mad at Germany for leaking it, and NATO's falling apart, and you get this whole terrible scenario.
Yeah, well, and I mean, it goes right to the heart of the contradiction of the entire thing. They started this war with their insistence that nothing can stop us from bringing Ukraine into NATO. And if we can't do it this year right now, we're going to do it de facto. We're going to integrate their military with ours as best as we can. We're going to focus on interoperability, and we're going to spend the entire autumn of 2021 telling the Russians, you're damn right, we're bringing Ukraine into NATO, and there's nothing you can do to stop us. And then as soon as the war starts, Biden says there is a 0% chance that we are sending the Army, the Navy, the Marines in to fight this war. 82nd Airborne will be in Moldova. The 3rd Infantry Division will be, I don't know, in Virginia, wherever they sit around, in Germany. The Navy will be sailing in circles in the Black Sea. This is not our fight. And we are not going to war with Russia over Ukraine, which is the same thing as saying you're not allowed into NATO because we're not going to fight for you if it comes down to it. And so here we are. Now they're stuck in this contradiction. They're like, well, maybe we should escalate and fight for them a little more and a little more and a little more at a time, when that completely contradicts the theory of the case, which is if we went that far, we'd end up in a general nuclear war.
Yeah. And part of the case that Russia's made since prior to the war is that this isn't just about Ukraine and NATO. It's about NATO in Ukraine. And remember, right, before the war, Macron, who's now like the leader of the most hawkish element, before the war, it was Macron that reminded the West, when they were all saying you can't do this, that Putin's security concerns about weapons in Ukraine and Ukraine joining NATO are legitimate security concerns that he called them essential security concerns that we have to negotiate with Putin. So Macron was saying that before, and now you do get this escalation, and that's part of the fear, I think, when I talk to people about why these leaks are coming out about troops in Ukraine. The scariest scenario of all was that it was to prepare for escalation, with the idea being that it would lay the groundwork for sending more troops. That the idea being that you can sell more troops by desensitizing the West, by pointing out that there's already troops there. We've already taken the risk. How much more of a risk is it to send more? So one of the possibilities about why all these leaks came out, and I guess we still need to talk about these. We haven't told you what we're talking about yet, but one of the reasons why all these leaks came out in this 2-week period, the scariest scenario, I think, is that it is to prepare for the possibility of sending more, by convincing the West, by saying, look, we've already sent some and Putin didn't respond. How much more of a risk is it to send more? But that's a very dangerous game, because people like to play this game of knowing Putin's mind, but nobody knows what the red line is. How many, is it acceptable for Putin to have a few Western troops giving targeting information for long-range missiles? But is it acceptable to send in hundreds of troops? Is it acceptable to be, actually in the fight? A French general, the the head of the French armed forces, wrote a paper in Le Monde, I think yesterday, saying that, France could get together a force of, I think he said 20,000 soldiers. Like, is that crossing the line for Putin? So it's a very dangerous game.
Yeah. Well, and you're right that they keep doing that. And the War Party this has been their mantra now this whole time is, well, he hasn't nuked us yet. He hasn't nuked us yet. And, this Emily Harding from the Center for Strategic and International Studies was in, I guess, last month in February. They did this symposium, and of course, CSIS is sponsored all by the military-industrial complex. You can read it right on their website. And she says, we've been fiddling while Rome burns, and we've been debating. She says, we've been debating amongst ourselves, like exactly what tiny weapon system is going to push us over the top or not. Now for 2 years, and if we hadn't been dithering earlier on. There's a little Sarah Palin idiocy thrown in there for you. If we hadn't been dithering, if we had actually provided the things that we should have provided, we would have been much better off now. She just claims like, oh, yeah, the tanks, the artillery systems, whatever she has in mind, definitely would have made the difference. She explains no argument why we should believe that that's true. It just goes without saying. And then she says, I love this, it's self-centered of Americans to worry that if they do this, it will provoke Russia into widening the war, because she says that just hasn't happened. But she's the one saying we haven't given enough weapons yet. We haven't done what it takes. So she's just saying the fact that they haven't nuked us yet means that they definitely won't. And then I just love this because it could come out of the mouth of Sarah Palin or John McCain or your junior high school reading teacher who doesn't know the first thing about it. She says, Russia's a bully. They respond to strength. And it's like, she's going to get my home state nuked off the face of the earth with this crap. It's completely stupid.
It's a mindless argument, Scott. And one of the premises of it that drives me crazy is when people say we've done this and Putin hasn't escalated. And in fact, we don't even know that that's true, because you don't know that some of the things Putin's doing now weren't escalations. Putin wasn't doing a whole lot of the long-range strikes into Ukraine until Ukraine took out the bridge and stuff like that. He has escalated.
That's right.
It's not only crazy to say he hasn't escalated, it's crazy to assume that someone else's mind well enough to know when they'll escalate. Suppose Putin hasn't escalated. Credit to Putin, right?
Well, and suppose that she's right, that if we just give them enough Abrams tanks and enough attack-'em artillery pieces, that'll be enough to help Ukraine win the war and push the Russians out. Well, what's he going to do then? Nothing. It's a total zero-sum thing. She says we'd be much better off, meaning I guess that would really tip the balance of power in favor of Ukraine. Well, then might he escalate?
Yeah, it's a very dangerous game to play. It assumes he hasn't escalated. It assumes when he will escalate. And it also assumes, as you said, that if you do succeed and, the existence of Russia is threatened or Crimea is threatened, it assumes that Putin will let that happen. And that's a really, really dangerous assumption. And this idea of give him a little more, give him a little more. This is the talk that's happening right now again, too, because when Macron says not only, we could send troops into Ukraine, let's not take that off the table. And he's also pressuring Scholz in Germany to send very long range Taurus missiles. And, Scholz says, we can't do that because that'll provoke Russia to, further we want to provoke them. And Macron's answer is exactly to sort of sarcastically remind Germany that you used to say, no tanks, you used to say no planes, you used to say no long-range missiles. You were the guys who said you'd send, helmets and lunch. It's this, and he says, we're always 6 months behind. It's this kind of mocking that every time we say we're going to do more, we don't do it, then we do that little one, and then we have to push you to the next one, then we do that little one. Some people use the I hate this scenario, but the boiling frog scenario, that if you just slowly keep turning it up, this assumption that Putin's not going to notice, and that's a really, really stupid and dangerous assumption. And so you've got Macron saying, let's actually not take it off the table, that we're actually going to send troops in. And part of this is a distraction, Scott. Part of this talk about whether we should send troops in is a distraction from the revelations of the more dangerous idea that we do have troops in. And, this kind of got kicked off in I think it was February 19th, with this leak of a transcript of a conversation between these very senior German Air Force officials. And what they're talking about is a briefing for the Secretary of Defense on precisely this idea of, will we send long-range Taurus missiles into Ukraine? And they're talking about the difficulties of how you would actually do it. And one of them is heard on the conversation to say, we know how the British do it. They have people on site. It's like, what? There's actually British people on site with the long-range missiles. And then, although there's all this sort of getting mad at him for saying it, the British Prime Minister's office confirmed it recently. And I'm reading a direct quote now because I happen to have it in front of me. He said, beyond the small number of personnel we do have in country supporting the armed forces of Ukraine, we don't have any plans for a larger deployment. So there's Britain saying we do have troops in Ukraine. And then again, pressuring Schultz to send Taurus missiles to Ukraine. A week after that first revelation, Schultz says, I can't send long-range missiles into Ukraine because that would require the presence of Germans in Ukraine like the British and the French have to do. And that would risk, he says, that would risk participation in the war. So here's Germany saying out loud, Britain and France have troops in Ukraine. Britain confirms it. France says, if we don't, maybe we should. The same transcript also, by the way, when they're saying, could the Ukrainians do it on their own? One Luftwaffe official says, look, it's known that there's numerous people in Ukraine in civilian attire who speak with American accents. So then you get this language of, well, maybe there's Americans there. And then you remember that in 2023, John Kirby of the NSC, the NSC, said that there is a small U.S. presence in Ukraine. Then you get this massive New York Times article based on interviews with 200 current and former officials. This is like almost like an organized leak. It's like,
slight correction there is they claim it was 200 interviews with, we don't know exactly how many officials. But
correct.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Correct.
Go ahead.
Yeah, with former and current officials, where they reveal the extent of a CIA presence there that at first we've been told was a small number, but it actually refers to scores of new officers. Now, for those of you who haven't read your Shakespeare for a while, a score is 20. So scores, we're looking at 40, 60.
The score is 24.
More. Is it
24?
Yeah. It's a lot.
Yeah.
So you get all these people sent in to help the Ukrainians, and they're passing on intelligence on where Russia's planning to strike, what weapons they're going to use, giving intelligence for targeting strikes, intelligence support for lethal operations against Russians in Ukraine. So now you get this leak that there's not only some U.S. forces in, but there's tons of CIA forces. And then on March the 8th, the foreign minister of Poland makes this stunning confirmation where he says NATO military personnel are already present in Ukraine. He says soldiers are present in Ukraine. I want to thank the countries who have done it. And unlike, the big mouth in Germany, I'm not going to tell you which countries they are, but they're there. So you've got Germany and Poland saying there's troops there. You've got the UK and the US confirming it. You've got this big New York Times thing, and all of a sudden you've got this. And then there was that earlier. That earlier leak that had said there was, what was it, Scott? Remember the number? Was it that said there's 97 NATO special ops personnel in Ukraine?
Yeah, this is the Jack Teixeira leak from a year ago.
Yeah, so that was the earlier one too. So you get this absolute storm of leaks and interviews saying that there's not NATO troops but troops of NATO countries in Ukraine. And then you have to ask, I think you have to ask, why is this coordinated? Why, after swearing there's no troops on the ground, you suddenly get France saying we could send troops, and then everyone saying there are troops? And I think Scott, the least scary option is that the West knows that they've lost the war and that they pushed Ukraine to fight with weapons.
Well, look, and we know that that's true. Ted, I mean, I'm sure you saw the intelligence community assessment summary that was released on February the 5th, where they don't use the word losing, but it's in there that, well, Putin thinks he's winning, and for the following reasons, he is winning. Yeah.
Yeah. And, when we talked, I think, on a previous show, in the town of Avdiivka fell, and now you've got, the Russians on several fronts slowly pushing west. And again, it's always important to remember in this war, it's not victory so far in this war is not measured in territory won. It's measured in attrition. Russia's just using up Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian weapons. They're grinding the country into non-existence unless, which can be solved by just negotiating tomorrow, as Putin said again recently. But I think it's possible, Scott, that in preparation for losing, there's going to be a lot of finger pointing. The West is going to be pointing at each other, and Ukraine at the West. And one thing this might be kind of laying the ground for is for the Western countries to say, look, we did everything we could. We even put troops on the ground, right? So it could be cover for that. A second reason they could be admitting to all this is to pressure the U.S. to send more aid and weapons to Ukraine, because nothing's coming or little's coming out of the States now, and the idea might be to threaten to send troops in and then say to Western governments it's far more palatable to send more weapons than to send troops, right? So the threat of troops from Macron could be, pressure to get the West to cough up more weapons. There's also reports that some of this is to create the sort of strategic ambiguity that if you don't want Putin to be confident there's no Western troops coming in because that would embolden him. So you say there's troops there and threaten to send more to create this sort of ambiguity and fear that Putin, maybe you better be careful how fast you're going to advance now, because we could send troops in. There was one report. It didn't really make the Western media at all. There was reports in the Ukraine media that Macron held a meeting of the parliamentary parties recently and said that one scenario in which he would send troops to Ukraine would be if Russia pressed on to Odessa and moved a certain amount west. So maybe you threaten troops in so that to tell Putin, be careful what you do, we'll send troops. There's that possibility. And then again, like I said, the scariest possibility is that they're serious, and that the reason why you admit there's troops there is to desensitize people and say, how big a risk is it to send troops? We did send troops. So there's these several possibilities, but this is a very risky, very scary game to be playing.
Yeah. Hey, you guys, did you know that I don't just write books, I publish them? Well, the Institute does, and I'm the director, so yeah. 13 of them now, including my 4. We published 5 more in 2023. Lori Calhoun and Tom Wood's books about the COVID regime, Joe Solis Mullen on the fake China threat, Jim Bovard's latest, Last Rights, and our managing editor, Keith Knight's Domestic Imperialism. And we've got more great titles coming in 2024. Check them out at libertarianinstitute.org/books and help support our anti-government efforts at libertarianinstitute.org/donate. And thank you. Hey, y'all, Scott here. Let me tell you about Roberts & Roberts Brokerage, Inc. Who knew? Artificial bank credit expansion leads to price inflation and terribly distorted markets. If you've got any savings left at all, you need to protect them. You need to put some, at least, into precious metals. Well, Roberts & Roberts can set you up with the best deals on silver, gold, platinum, and palladium. And they've been doing this since 1977. Hey, if you just need some sound advice about sound money, they're there for you too. Call Tim Fry and the guys at 800-874-9760. That's 800-874-9760. Or check them out at rrbi.co. That's rrbi.co. You'll be glad you did. Well, and the New York Times piece about the CIA presence there, I mean, they're basically confessing a huge part of the Russians' argument about how America was taking Ukraine and turning it into a base for war against Russia. But I guess the argument being that, well, whatever, we're 2 years into this war, so it's okay to go ahead and admit what we started doing after 2014 there. But boy, does it undermine their case about how totally unprovoked this war was when we find out they had 14 bases on the border and they were killing people from them.
Yeah. So this whole, unprovoked argument, and as you said, the kind of explosive piece about this New York Times article wasn't just that it revealed the size of the CIA presence during the war. It revealed the size of the CIA presence long before the war. And so it helps confirm that you're turning Ukraine into an anti-Russian, bridgehead on our border. And it also confirms Russia's story about how involved the West is, because it gives, it says the CIA is doing, really serious stuff, like giving intelligence to help attack Russians on Ukrainian soil and target information. So, I mean, it really confirmed not only the legitimate security concerns of Russia in terms of the provoked war, but it confirms Russia's story of just how involved the West is in the current war. And again, this is just really dangerous stuff.
Okay, so We have short time left here.
Yeah.
7 minutes? But so talk to me about the fall of Avdiivka and the change of regime at the top. Is not just the top general, but his entire staff was kind of regime change out of there. Obviously, the president has suspended elections, but now he's got a whole new military team in there. So what all does that mean?
He's got a whole new military team in there, and Zaluzhny, the former general, has been given the honor of being the new ambassador to the UK, which is a euphemism for let's get him out of the country, possibly because he's so popular, and who knows exactly why. But Zelensky wanted Zaluzhny not just out of the army, but out of the country. The new general Skirsky is seen as somebody who's much more likely to follow Zelensky's orders. That's exactly what he did. Zelensky went out of town for a meeting of world leaders and left instructions that Avdiivka is to be defended, don't lose it. They sent the troops in to try to hold it. What happened is exactly what Zaluzhny said would happen. They first of all, a lot of them were missiled in the town. They were sleeping in the day before and never even made it in. But when they got in, it was undefensible. They had to retreat. They didn't have a proper plan to retreat. They were sheltering. They left lots of people behind. Tons of people died. In other words, exactly, Zaluzhny told them what will happen if you try to hold this place. So they fired him. They put in a general who would hold it. What happened is exactly what Zaluzhny said would happen. It was a disaster. So the Russians took that town. And the Western media portrays this as a symbolic victory. It's Russia's first big victory in a year. It's symbolic, big deal. It's not a symbolic victory. I'm not a military analyst, but I'm told it's a major strategic victory because this is the town that kind of defended and fortified the Donbass. There's not a lot of fortified towns west from here. Ukraine has to retreat, and that really leaves it the possibility of Russia, securing the lands that they have claimed in the Donbass and moving west at a speed possibly of their choosing. They could be going slow for lots of reasons. One might be because it's not true that they want to rush to Kiev and take over Ukraine. That was never true. And the other possible reason, like I said, Scott, is that Russia doesn't plan on winning this war as a war of territory. I don't believe Russia ever wanted Ukrainian territory. They could have taken it in 2014 if they wanted to. This is a war of attrition where they're going to make it impossible for Ukraine to fight because they run out of weapons and they run out of men until Ukraine's going to have to come to the negotiating table. And Scott, we've talked about this so many times because it's the tragedy of Ukraine is that they are going to have to come to the negotiating table because of this. And when they do, they're going to get the exact same deal, only slightly worse than they could have had the day before the war, before 500,000 Ukrainians have been killed and injured. And that's the crime of this, is that the West told Zelensky when he had a possible peace. I mean, one leader of the Ukrainian delegation during the peace talks in Istanbul has now said, we were popping the champagne bottles. We knew we had a deal. And then the West came and said, you can't do it. And it forced them to fight for 2 years. Hundreds of thousands of people dead and wounded, and they're going to end up going back to the negotiating table to get the exact same deal with less land now and more people dead. And that's the horror of Ukraine, that the West used Ukraine to fight Russia and didn't let them make their own peace to go on to fight for the West's goals and decimated Ukraine.
That's just horrible. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So, let's see. I got distracted Googling up that champagne quote. Now I forgot what my last question was going to be. Well, I guess going back to that intelligence assessment, the declassified version that they released on February 5th, they say in there that not only is Russia gaining on the battlefield there, but that back at home, they've increased their production of every kind of military wear and artillery shells, and they have done such a great job, it says in there, of recruitment that they're able to spare their conscripts, keep them as reserves to free up the professional army. So they're not even sending conscripts to the front right now. Yeah, and they're not going to be.
This war that was meant to, decimate and contain Russia has produced a a Russia that is, stronger on the international scene and the multipolar world and the global south. They're stronger economically. They're stronger, not weaker, militarily. They have not brought down the government. Putin's in for another 6 years. And you can say all you want that Russian elections aren't fair, and Russian elections aren't totally fair. They're not as bad as people sometimes say in the West, but they're not fair. But really reliable polling, Scott, like polling by polling agencies that are funded by the U.S., like really good polling companies, they showed all along that if a fair election were to be held, Putin would win easily. And they showed his popularity at about 87%. He won the election about 86%. Sounds incredible, but it's actually exactly what the popularity polls have showed. So whether you want to call Russia's elections fair or not, there's no sense in which the Putin government's been shaken. So you haven't reduced Russia militarily, economically, diplomatically, or politically. You've ruined Ukraine.
Yep.
But you haven't even touched Russia.
Not even touched them. Yep. And they say in there, they elaborate on and on about how they've strengthened their economic ties with China and the rest of Asia and the global south, meaning Africa, I guess. And
Africa,
all that.
South America, parts of Asia outside of China.
And on the election, Ted, just real quick, I mean, I did read, and it seemed credible that they banned two opponents for doing their paperwork wrong, supposedly, or something like that, and had only very safe little opponents. But still, so that means what? He would have won by 70% instead of 85 or whatever it is. Because he is, as you said, an extraordinarily popular president. And it's not exactly democracy, but hey, this ain't a limited constitutional republic either, you might have noticed over here. And it is, he's an autocrat. He's a strong man, but he is one with essentially broad popular support. And of course, in the New York Times, they go, well, that's just because the TV lies to them all day. And in fact, to read the hard news, New York Times, first major report on the election and the election results over there, they're just seething and crying and gnashing their teeth as they write excuse after excuse after excuse and claim after claim after emotional claim throughout the story, because they just can't let you conclude that, well, maybe he's kind of a jerk, but they seem to like him. Or, you know what I mean? You can't just leave us with that. It's got to be stolen by, whatever, illegitimate power.
I'm not an expert on the political system in Russia. There's really good stuff written about this. Richard Sakwa's written really good stuff on this. And, the truth is somewhere in between. The Russian elections are a complete fraud and Russian elections are a democracy. The truth is somewhere in between that. But the reality is it kind of doesn't matter. We can argue about political systems all you want. The evidence is very strong that Putin, if his elections aren't real, his popularity is. And if there were to be fair elections, he would win. And, Navalny never would have garnered more than 4, 5, 6, maybe 8, 9% of the vote. Never would have ever. Wouldn't have affected if he could have run this election all he wanted.
The Wall Street Journal said, he was Vladimir Putin's most effective opponent. Okay, so in other words, he would have won the election by a super majority landslide no matter what, even if you put him up against the next 20 guys, because Navalny had no support outside of Moscow.
Right. I mean, it might have been latest polling show. It might have been as low as like 1%. So if the West is going to claim that Navalny was Putin's most potent opponent, then that's just an argument for how much, even in a fair election, even if this one wasn't, even in a fair election, that's how much Putin would win by. And we don't have to debate, like Scott, for you and me, that it's the foreign policy. You and I aren't talking about, what things are like in Russia and stuff like that. That's not the part that's important. I mean, for what we're dealing with, it's important if you live in Russia. The part that's important for us is that part of this whole thing in Ukraine was to destabilize Putin's government, to try to bring about a regime change in Russia. And that's been an utter failure. So it hasn't weakened Russia militarily, like Austin said. Russia's stronger now militarily. In fact, their recovery from their early mistakes has been remarkable. They've strengthened militarily, they've strengthened diplomatically, they've strengthened economically, and Putin's stronger now as the leader of Russia than he was. And the U.S. is just going to have to deal with the fact right now that Putin's there for another 6 years. Like, whatever your hopes were, you now have to deal with the reality that you've got Putin for the next 6 years. And they did not destabilize his regime. He's stronger after this election than he was after the previous one.
And now we're just this much further away from a reasonable relationship with Russia than we were before, light years now compared to where we were in 2020, or even, the worst of Obama years and the coup and the war in Syria and the rest. It's just a absolute catastrophe. I'm sorry we're out of time. We've got to go to our next guest here, but thank you so much for all your great articles at the Libertarian Institute, at antiwar.com, and the rest. Really appreciate you, man.
Thanks so much, Scott. It was great talking to you.
The Scott Horton Show, Anti-War Radio, can be heard on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, APSradio.com, antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and libertarianinstitute.org.